Kenya has just gone through what is arguably the most monetized and commercialized general elections in the region. On ground, over 150 helicopters were observed being used by candidates at presidential, senatorial, and gubernatorial level. High-end SUVs were also observed being used by majority of the candidates. On one rally, the Azimio la Umoja One Kenya presidential candidate arrived at a rally with a convoy of 7 helicopters, of which 4 were privately owned. It was established that renting a chopper or helicopter was going for $2,000 per hour. There are suspicions that most of the money that was flowing in the election campaigns was coming from dirty sources, including syndicated corruption and money laundering. Kenya in 2013 developed a progressive election campaign financing law, but this law has twice been rendered futile by the same parliament that passed it. It is clear that none of the political elite in Kenya would wish to have this law enforced on them, hence the conspiracy to fight it. In the judgment made by court in May 2022, whereas court found that Parliament does not have powers to approve or disapprove the spending limits, it refused to quash the decision of the National Assembly to annul the enforcement of campaign financing regulations developed and published by the IEBC in 2021. It is against this backdrop that the Alliance for Finance Monitoring (ACFIM), in partnership with African Election Observers Network (AFIONET), have organized this webinar to interrogate the scale and magnitude of monetization of elections in Kenya and the lessons African electoral jurisdictions can draw from this.
Welcome to the 9th Money in Politics webinar series. My name is Abel Eseru. This webinar is brought to you by Alliance for Finance Monitoring, which is a political finance watchdog renowned for monitoring election campaign financing and knowledge generation on the subject of political finance in Africa. ACFIM has partnered with the African Election Observers Network, that's AFIONET, which is a renowned coordinating platform for African election observation blocks, namely East and Horn of African Election Observation Network, then the West African Election Observers Network, WAON, and then also the Southern African Development Community Election Support Network. We are live streaming this webinar on all our social media platforms, that is, and also YouTube channel of ACFIM and AFIONET. Kindly make sure you like and follow ACFIM and AFIONET on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube channel. Today we have a panel of 5 experts that will join me to unpack the theme on monetized Kenya elections 2022, what lessons for Africa. But before I proceed to introduce the guest panelists, allow me on behalf of ACFIM and AFIONET to send an apology to all those watching from wherever you are for us not having a female panelist today. It was not our deliberate effort that we don't have one, but we had initially confirmed 2 female guest panelists, but due to unforeseen engagements, they sent in their regrets and they couldn't be able to participate, but they did also nominate some of the male guests here today to step in on their behalf. So allow me introduce the guests who are with me today. I will start with Mr. Derek Frederick Makandi from Kenya. He is a lawyer by training, an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. He has over 9 years work experience in legal aid, legislative and policy reforms, electoral governance, human rights and research. He is currently working with Transparency International Kenya as the Programs Officer, Policy, Legal and Institutional Frameworks. Derek has also previously worked with Mzalendo Trust, Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, and Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. Derek, you are welcome to this webinar. The next person who is also with us today is Mr. Henry Muguzi from Uganda. Henry is a seasoned campaign finance expert with over 12 years of experience in analyzing the legal and institutional frameworks for campaign financing in several electoral jurisdictions. He has observed elections in multiple countries, including Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Lebanon, and South Africa. He has authored several reports. Some include unregulated campaign spending and its impact on electoral participants in Uganda, and also commercialized politics and captivity of state institutions in Uganda. Henry is the founding executive director of Alliance for Finance Monitoring and also a founding member of the African Election Observers Network, AFIONET. Henry, you're welcome to this webinar series.
Thank you, Abel.
And we are also joined by You're welcome. We are also joined by Mr. Chimuka Nachimbinga from Zambia. He is the Democratic Governance Program Lead at Transparency International Zambia. He possesses over 7 years of experience in governance research, budget analysis, social economic advocacy, social accountability, social protection, debt analysis, public policy analysis, among others. He has acquired various trainings in the areas of monitoring political corruption, abuse of state resources in elections, illicit financial flows, and domestic resource mobilizations in the era of digital economies in Africa. Mr. Chimuka, you are also welcome to this webinar series. And then we shall also be joined by Mr. Edgar Tabaro, who is from Uganda. He is a lawyer and governance expert. He is currently a senior partner at KTA Advocates in Kampala and also a special envoy for Sudan's oldest political party, UMMA party. He is an emeritus senior lecturer and law school law school dean of Uganda Christian University. He writes and speaks on politics in the Great Lakes region. Mr. Edgar Tabaro, you're once again welcome to the webinar series. Though it's your first time being here, we have hosted you several times on some of our virtual talk shows, but it's your first time being hosted on the Money in Politics webinar series. You're welcome, Mr. Edgar. And then lastly, we are going to have Dr. Kazibwe Samuel from also Uganda. Dr. Samuel Kazibwe is an award-winning broadcast journalist, academic, and researcher. He holds a PhD in Cultural and Media Studies from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. He also holds a master's degree in human rights from Makerere University and a bachelor's degree in mass communication. As a journalist in the last 15 years, Dr. Kazibwe has worked as a reporter, news anchor, talk show producer, stroke host, and news editor for several local media outlets. He is currently the manager for research, innovations, and development at CBS FM in Uganda. Besides journalism, Dr. Kazibwe is also a senior lecturer at Uganda Christian University in the School of Journalism, Media, and Communication. His interests are in research that fall under mass communication theory, media law, development communication, governance, and human rights. So these are the 5 guests who are going to be discussing with us today the theme on monetized Kenya, monetized and what lessons for Africa. So I am going to start with our brother from Kenya, that is Mr. Derek. Your organization, Transparency International Kenya, was one of the 3 civil society organizations that sued the National Assembly of Kenya and the Independent Electoral Boundaries Commission on grounds that the absence of campaign finance laws will threaten the integrity of the August 2022 general elections. You have lived through the just concluded Kenyan elections. Bring us up to speed with the scale and magnitude of monetized election campaigns as you saw it. Mr. Derek. Hello, Mr. Derek. Can you get us? Can you hear me?
Hello, Gerald. Can you hear me? I lost minutes.
Okay. I was saying your organization, Transparency International Kenya,
Hello,
was
can you hear
one.
me? I don't know whether it's my internet or yours, but at some point you are breaking. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you clearly. I don't know whether you can now hear me.
Yes, I can hear you, but you are breaking suddenly. I don't know. Can you hear me now? Am I?
Yes, I can. I do hear you clearly. I think it's your network. So I think as Mr. Derek is connecting, I think I will bring in Henry. Henry, you've been following keenly on some of these issues in Kenya, and we know that the National Assembly of Kenya decided to throw away the Election Campaign Finance Act that was enacted by the same National Assembly in 2013. And there were debates around the corner that without that Election Campaign Finance Act, we would likely to see that a lot of money would be able to flood in the elections of Kenya, and there would be some other candidates would not be able to spend in line with what others have, so there would be an even playing field. So you, as an election observer who was in Kenya, can you be able to bring us up to speed on what was the scale of monetization of elections in Kenya?
Thank you very much, Abel. And true to your word, I was in Kenya. And I think for purposes of context, the reason we have chosen to discuss money today is because Africa, across the continent, our elections seem to be suffering from the effects of undeclared, undisclosed, opaque political finance. There appears to be too much money flowing in our elections and nobody knows where it is coming from. When it comes to Kenya, you'll be interested to note that most of the studies that have been conducted have rated Kenya as a country that is home to the most expensive elections on the continent. And when we say most expensive, it speaks to the amount of money candidates and political parties pump in. So I was in Nairobi for a significant amount of time. I wanted to understand that election. And of course, we, by the time of my departure, we already knew what was happening because already on the campaign period was awash with choppers flying from one constituency to the next. And you would wonder how choppers now become like grasshoppers flying in the crisscrossing the air, the skies of Kenya. The thing is that what I saw there in terms of campaign spending, I think is something that many of us in Africa have not seen. Earlier on in the intro, there's where they pointed out the Azimio la Umoja, one Kenya candidate arriving at a rally with a convoy of 7 helicopters. And we were told that 4 of these were his owned, and each of those helicopters had been purchased at $2.5 million US. And so for the 4, that was 10 million gone. But the other 3 had been rented. I should tell you that most of these, about 100 of them, were rented from South Africa and brought into Kenya. And of course, like it was noted, they were being hired at a rate of $2,000 per hour. Now, for those candidates who are at the MCA level, candidates at parliamentary level, at governor level that were using these, you discover that those who spent about 60 days with these helicopters, and if they are using them for 6 to 7 hours a day, they ended up paying a bill of $840,000 US. That's on helicopters alone. But of course, they also had on the ground convoys of SUVs, very expensive SUVs, because in that part of Africa, for any candidate worth his salt, you must be seen to have very luxurious and expensive SUVs as part of your campaign. Now, when it comes to the presidential level, I sat down with one of the political analysts to understand how much each of these presidential candidates had put in. I was informed that the UDA candidate, Ruto William, because he had started spending money as soon as they were sworn into that final term in office, they calculated that he had spent up to 70 billion Kenya shillings in the last 4 years. And that spending was going into the donations to groups of youth, groups of market vendors, groups of mama mboga, groups of border riders, groups of young people, women, the disabled across the country who were getting city capital to kind of propel their businesses forward. And so when you calculate 7 billion Kenya shillings would boil down to about $60 million. And when you translate it into Uganda shilling, into other currency, it becomes an insane amount of money that was spent only on making sure that the voters get to see and understand candidate Ruto as a candidate of a big heart, a kind one. And of course, there were also other costs that were involved with the went with the campaign administration, and of course that level of spending. Of course, then at the lower level of women representative, of the MCA candidates. MCA candidates are these are the people that contest for to sit in the legislative councils at the counties. You get to see that even at that level, choppers would fly. But also there were issues of direct voter inducement and buying, where I was surprised. You follow this candidate, and whenever they stop over, the voters would approach the vehicles, the convoys, and then they line up. And at one occasion, I asked why were they rushing to line up, who has told them, and they said nobody needs to tell them, because for the norm is that upon arrival of the candidate, you line up so that you are easily counted, and then the candidate must know how much money to pull out of the vehicle, and then each of you get your share. And so they would distribute money on the queues as if they were these friends of ours in Nigeria. We see the ogas. When the oga arrives, then money flies around. But of course, also the investment in advertising. Yeah, the presence each candidate was trying to make sure they have on television. These are very expensive undertakings, because Kenya is home to a number of very popular but also high-level television stations. Therefore, if you're going to appear on KTN, at the same time appear on NTV, and then appear on Citizen, and then appear on KBC, and other very popular TV stations, and you would see the what's it called? The frequency would be about to every after 30 minutes an advert is running. And of course, they're running not for one day or a week. They've been running for months. And so these are very expensive things that are expensive undertakings. And so I want to tell you, as a Ugandan, that I think the research, I confirmed what I had read in the studies published by International IDEA and other institutions, that in Africa, Kenya is home to the most expensive elections. Of course, now, last but not least, we had an engagement with the Electoral Commission chairperson earlier on, I think about 2 weeks, 10 days prior to elections, and who were informed that even the ballot papers, especially the presidential ballot papers, had been designed so expensively, because we were told that the security features on the ballot papers were much more than the security features on their biggest banknote. and therefore it was more expensive to print those ballot papers than to print banknotes. We're talking about an election that is quite expensive in terms of the national GDP. That's what I can tell you in a summary. Otherwise, we could speak about this until cows return home.
Thank you, Henry. I don't know whether Mr. Derek is back. I wanted him to give us his view on what he saw, because he was in Kenya longer than any of us here, and he saw whatever happened, and also he was part of the team from the civil society organization that went to court trying to challenge the decision by the National Assembly of not allowing the Independent Electoral Boundaries Commission to implement the Campaign Finance Election Act of 2013. But if he's not yet back, Andrew, okay, Derek, I think you're now on. I don't know whether, can you hear us? Hello, Derek. I think Derek still has internet challenges. I want now to go to Mr. Chimuka from Zambia. I know your new president is doing a lot of things to try to transform the country and bring back order and sanity into Zambia. But data from South Africa Revenue Authority, as Henry already hinted earlier, that there were very many choppers in Kenya. The data from the South African Revenue Authority revealed that Kenya imported 325 helicopters for lease from South Africa in 2020 alone. And most of these helicopters were used for election campaigns. As Henry was there on ground and he has testified to you, most of these choppers were used for campaigns. And using choppers for campaigns, as it were in Kenya, is not uncommon in Zambia. We for a fact know that hiring or later on, even just buying helicopters involve big numbers of cash. According to you, what is the source of this money some of these politicians use to buy or hire these helicopters, and also how do they recoup it back? Mr. Chimuka?
Okay, thank you so much for that question.
Could you kindly work on your headroom a little bit? You are not seeing very well.
I hope you are able to hear me clearly. Let me start by giving a brief background in terms of political and campaign financing from the Zambian. You are not getting me clearly?
No, we are getting you. You continue.
Hello?
Yes, Mr. Chimuka, we are getting you. Can
Hello?
you proceed? Hello, are you getting me? I think.
Hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Derek. Can you hear me?
I've had to. Yes, I can hear you now. I've had to use my. It's Murphy slow today. Everything is not working.
Okay, fine. Thanks for coming back. So we were with Mr. Chimuka, but he has also gone. So I had posed earlier to you a question. You were part of your organization, Transparent International Uganda, was one of the 3 civil society organizations that sued the National Assembly of Kenya and the Independent Electoral Boundaries Body on grounds that the absence of the election campaign finance law would threaten the integrity of the August 2020 elections that was just concluded. You lived through these just concluded elections. Can you please bring us up to speed on what was the magnitude and the scale of monetized election campaigns in Kenya? How you saw it?
All right. Thank you very much, and of course, apologies again for the mishap. I don't know. I think there could be someone paying money just to make sure this conversation doesn't go on, but we move on nonetheless. So I had earlier promised to give you some background on just campaign financing in Kenya and how we got here. But I think I will start with your question on the magnitude of how much the monetization of politics in Kenya.
No, you can give us, and then you go to the question. It's okay.
All right. The background is important just to set the context of how things are, and just to give you an idea on the framework, the legislative and political framework that we have in the country. And it will be very important when we get to talk about the challenges and even the case that we took to court. So historically looking, the very first time we tried to regulate campaign financing in Kenya, which of course is very important, just to, of course, I think we can all agree that an unregulated environment makes it very difficult to just get even just put figures and of course respond to the negative impact of monetization in politics. So the very first time we tried to come up with a regulatory framework for campaign financing was years back in 1970s, sometimes midway in 1970s. And we tried to pass a law that put a limit to the amount of money that politicians could use to campaign. That was in 1974. So just to give, in terms of figures, the figure that was passed then was around 40,000 Kenyan shillings. That is around 400 USD, if in those times, 400 USD to campaign, and that was a very reasonable figure. But moving there was a small issue, actually a very big issue in the in the framing of that law. What that law provided was that these regulations or those limits could only kick in after parties were done with their nominations or primaries. So it was only after parties were done with the primaries that the regulatory framework would apply. But the mischief was that at that time, Kenya was a one-party state. So immediately after the party nominations of that one party, everyone automatically got into parliament because we were a one-party state. So there were no campaigns after the nominations. So you see that. So there was a mischief in that the regulations kicked in at a point where there were no campaigns at all. So we go with those regulations up to 1992. And in 1992, we had our first multi-party elections in Kenya. Kenya became a multi-party state. We had numerous parties. We had our first elections, but at that point, that law was forgotten. But shortly after the elections, Parliament nullified the entire provision on campaign financing on the grounds that it was unreasonable and unachievable and not practical. So we get into the multi-party era without any regulatory framework at all until 2010, when we passed our new constitution. And our new constitution had a provision that required our election management body, the IBC, to pass regulations on, to regulate the amount of money used in campaign. So we are at 2010. We have elections coming in 3 years' time, in 2013. We have a constitution, and Parliament, to give effect, to give life, or sometimes I call it death, to that constitutional provision, passes an act, the election campaign drafts a bill, the election campaign financing bill, that was supposed to regulate the 2013 general elections. So come very close to the elections, Parliament has not done anything with that bill. So we get into the 2013 elections with a bill, which of course you cannot enforce a bill. So we don't have any regulations. Parliament decides, no, this one can wait up to the next parliament. So we get into the 2013 general elections with no regulatory framework at all. Shortly after the 2013 elections, actually one of the first legislative agendas by the new parliament was to pass a new bill, the Election Campaign Financing Bill. So they drafted a new bill, passed it into law, and we were so happy now we have a bill. Let's wait for the general elections. So the next general elections come in 2017, and there was another mischief that was sneaked into the bill. The bill required the election management body to draft regulations 1 year before a general election, and send those regulations to Parliament for approval. So 1 year before the general elections, that is in 2016, because our elections were in 2017, our election management body called the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission does just that, drafts the regulations, sends them to Parliament a year before, but what does Parliament do? Parliament rejects those regulations and says, no, these regulations are not practical. There was no public consultation, and a draft of reasons, and rejects those regulations. So when Parliament rejects those regulations, that means we don't have regulations, but we have an act. But 6 months to the election, Parliament does something even more interesting. It passes a bill that suspends the operation of the entire act until after the until after the general elections. So whether or not even the regulations were in place, we didn't have an act because the act was suspended up to after the general elections. So we go into the next general elections without any regulatory framework at all. We don't have the act, it has been suspended. We don't have the regulations, they were rejected. So the elections come 2017 and they end, and immediately after the 2017 elections, that suspension clause expires. So now we have an act, and we are looking forward to the 2022 general elections, which recently passed, and now we know that now we will have regulations. So come 2021, of course we are very positive. IBC, our electoral body, drafts regulations, sends them to Parliament, and now we are very positive, but Parliament rejects them again. And Parliament gives very interesting reasons. It says, number one, IBC submitted it to them too close to the 1 year period. So it says that because of course, the law requires the regulations to be sent to IBC at least 1 year before the general election. But Parliament says, okay, you did it 1 year before, but it was so close to the 1 year period that we couldn't have had enough time to open it up for discussion and review. That is reason number one. Number two, it says the spending limits that were part of those regulations, the spending caps, were too unreasonable. In fact, in some instances, they were too high. In some instances, they were too low. So it's not practical. Then number three, it says some of the provisions are unconstitutional. I hope you can hear me. Some of the provisions are unconstitutional. So we will not accept it. But the problem with that is that, sorry, I hope you can hear me. Yeah. So the problem with that is some of those, actually, we would say 90% of the regulations were borrowed from the Act and just put in a different format. So by Parliament arguing this
Wow. Derek was giving us a very good context and background on election campaign financing in Kenya. But I think it still has network challenges. But I know, Mr. Edgar, you are a seasoned lawyer and you've been listening to the actions of the Kenyan National Assembly of not of rendering the Election Campaign Finance Act twice futile. You, as an expert in the areas of governance and also the geopolitics of our region in the Great Lakes, what do you make of the actions of the National Assembly of Kenya? Why at each time election nears, the IEBC wants to makes regulations and takes to them, they come up with excuses and they don't approve the regulations and they end up throwing away the Election Campaign Finance Act. Unmute yourself.
You can hear me now, I believe. Okay, now I think the bigger picture in relation to the monetization of politics in Kenya has its roots in the political economy of Kenya, and I don't think it's productive to discuss the law as it is or the law as we want it to be without looking at the underpinnings, the political economy foundations of how politics has rolled out in Kenya. Now, some critical facts that we ought to consider. One, Kenya was governed as a colony during the pre-independence period under colonial rule. It was an extension of the British Empire, and it was governed not through the external office of the United Kingdom, but rather through the Secretary for Colonies, as in it was an appendage of the United Kingdom. As such, they developed a class of wealthy British aristocrats. Now, in the run-up to independence, the politics or the struggle for independence in Kenya was markedly different from, say, what we had in Tanzania and in Uganda. We shall recall that Tanzania was a mandate state, Uganda was a protectorate, and therefore the systems of governance were very different. In Kenya, the British were not willing to give it up without a fight. The same happened in the other colonies of Rhodesia and Cape, the Cape Colony, Cape and Transvaal, where Dr. Kaziwe schooled. He schooled in KwaZulu Natal. that was also part of the colony, the extension of the British Empire. Now, in all those territories, the fight for independence was a real war. Blood was shed. And that blood has significantly impacted on how politics has been rolled out in those countries. So, at independence, the matunda, what you'd call matunda ya uhuru in Kenya, was inherited by tribal lords, tribal chiefs, or titular heads of the ethnic groupings. And that's why, in many ways, the formations, and I dare say even on this occasion, have been around the tribal and titular heads of their communities. So at independence, whereas they tried to craft political parties that were based on ideology, they quickly morphed into their ethnic lenses. So we had Kadu of Odinga, Oginga Odinga. You had Kanu, which was more of a Kikuyu outfit, but had merged with another outfit of smaller political parties that were headed by Moi from the Kalenjin, group. So we had Kalenjin, led by Moi, we had Kikuyus, led by the Kenyatta family. You would go to the Kisis, led by Simon Nyachai. You go to the Luhya. That one was headed by, I think, if I recall well, Mudavadi's father, Musalia Mudavadi's father. Then from the coast, I think you had Ronald Ngala, the father of the father of Katana Ngala. So, in many ways, these tribal outfits or these tribal lords replaced the British aristocrats, and the only way they could access aristocracy was through government appointments. Nyachai was head of the civil service and at one time, I think, secretary for finance. So the political parties that have come into existence since then, and all formations, have been around access to state resources and aristocracy. So in many ways, when we talk about political party financing, in the manner in which it has been conceived elsewhere, it's not how it has been rolled out in Kenya. In Kenya, the political parties, as we know of them, are very different, markedly different in Kenya, in that every election year, we have new special purpose vehicles that have been crafted to access political power. To the extent that between 1992 and the present, some of the leaders of the political parties we know now have been through 3 or 4 different political parties. So the manner in which the political organizations have been crafted is very different from how we understand it, and therefore to regulate such formations, it's not your textbook approach to things. And because the legislation and enforcement is partly or much dependent on parliament, we are therefore asking the persons who are supposed to be regulated to regulate themselves. They'll make every attempt to fail that process. And I'll give a bit of context to it, why we have highly monetized elections in Kenya. Now, you can imagine the laws under the Railas. In the late 90s, after the 1997 elections, Raila, who had been a prisoner of the Moi regime for 8.5 years in solitary confinement, formed a kind of, they first called it cooperation, cohabitation, then eventual merger of the NDP and KANU. And if you recall at that time, one of the main reasons advanced by the Railas was that the Luos who had been excluded from the Matunda ya Uhuru was the opportunity for them to access now state resources and have their own own economic and financial base. That was the main argument for them joining KANU. I'm emphasizing this to give the underpinnings of monetized elections in Kenya. So when it comes to an election in Kenya, it's a do or die for the aristocrats, and therefore monies will be put at their disposal from all sources, known and unknown, legal and illegal, for them to maintain a stake in the politics. And mind you, I've told you that every political season we come up with new special purpose vehicles to access public office. And you know, alliances in Kenya don't last more than one election. They keep changing. Therefore, even being in the opposition in Kenya is not an absurdity. It can be a stepping stone to negotiating a new purpose vehicle, a new special purpose vehicle to obtain what? To obtain state power. So an election there is not just accessing titles and what have you. It is a matter of gaining and losing wealth. 3, Kenya has the largest middle class in sub-Saharan Africa. 48% of the Kenyan population is middle class. that is the average. The average in Africa is 18. Uganda is 22%. So we have more than half. We have more than twice the population of Kenya who are middle class than Ugandans. About 49% of Kenyans are digitized. They have access to digital gadgets. So the manner in which elections are conducted in such an environment is not the same as what we have in Uganda, which is a highly peasantry pre-industrial society. The show of money, the show of might in terms of financial capacity becomes very critical for any candidate who wishes to be sold to the public. So now enter the law. Enter the law. I mean, given the manner in which public officials of constitutional appointees are nominated in Kenya, take the Electoral Commission, the judiciary, although it is a public process and in many ways fairly transparent, we can't keep away the fact that some of these persons who emerge have very close relations in terms of either ethnicity, marriage affiliation, or other social affiliations like churches and golf clubs or social clubs with the same aristocrats that either nominate them or vote for them in these processes. So we are, in other words, saying that and this is where civil society is very critical. Independent civil society, NGOs are very critical in calling some of these officials to account. So from my side, I don't see, given the political economy of the political party formations in Kenya, I don't see this regulation taking effect in the short term. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Edgar, for that. I want now to bring Dr. Kasibwe Samuel. You've just listened to Henry, Edgar, and also Derek. And I know you've been doing some commentary and also you've done some research on Kenya and the elections from the past. From your own angle and analysis, what do you make of the Kenya's 2022 elections and in terms of electoral integrity and also spending? And also maybe if you can give us your own background on what you know about Kenya and its own elections.
Thank you so much for having me this afternoon. It is indeed true that I have followed the Kenyan election closely. Not only this one, but for quite some time. I followed the Kenyan elections, just like many other elections on the African continent. I have also been in Kenya severally. This year, particularly on matters related to elections. It's quite interesting that I come at a time when most of my colleagues on this panel have given quite a thorough context regarding the subject. Mr. Tabaro was on the spot when he went into the historical background of Kenya and how it informs the challenges we are trying to deal with in this discussion, and the regulatory background that has been given on this show. It is a given, or it's a fact, that politics is very expensive in Kenya. There is no question about that. In fact, 1 or 2 days ago, the newly sworn-in governor of Nairobi, Johnson Sakaja, stated it openly that he spent about 15 million Kenya shillings on his agents on the polling day. Now that's about 100,000 US dollars on just the polling day. Now you can imagine how much he spent prior. Media buying, billboards, and the other money is required for a typical campaign in a country like Kenya. So you can imagine how much an election can cost an individual politician. In fact, I think a week or two ago, Citizen did an interesting feature about the price of being a mheshimiwa, what it costs for you to become a honorable in Kenya. It's obscene. It's obscene. But just like Mr. Tabal has stated, the Kenyan problem in terms of political financing goes beyond regulation. It goes beyond regulation because we've got to ask ourselves, who are the recipients of these monies, most of which are ill-gotten? Who are the recipients? Because in Kenya, besides buying the voter, even the kingpins are on sale during and after election time. Even after elections, I mean, you're seeing what is happening. The realignments, even before the presidential elect is confirmed by the Supreme Court, the realignments. And history has shown that money has always changed hands in these realignments. It's an open secret in Kenya. So it's not only the voters that are bought, even the kingpins. In other countries, it's just the voters that are bought, given a few shillings in Uganda for you to be voted. In Kenya, even the kingpins, people you would think are beyond that, they will state their worth, that for me to join your camp, you've got to pay me this. And it is largely informed by the history, which has been presented very well in this discussion. Now go to the religious leaders. If you followed the campaigns in the last 2-3 years, religious institutions have been on the shelves, going for the highest bidder. If you follow the news in Kenya in the last 3 years, every Sunday evening, a politician has been donating on every Sunday and Saturday in Kenya, in the churches. But nobody has the audacity to question. I mean, sometimes they come in their groupings, release a few statements to question and to condemn, but it stops there. They continue receiving these monies. So of course, there are a few people who have oftentimes managed to sail through even without the money. But like they say, for every general rule, there is an exception. You would call them the outliers. They have always been there. But for me, they are very interesting cases to follow, despite being outliers. If you look, given the nature and the context of the Kenyan politics that we all know at this point, how are people like Lynette Chepkoril Toto able to win? Because she proudly says that this is going to be her first job. She's the woman representative for Bomet. And she says this is going to be her first job. So her first paycheck is going to come from Parliament. Then, how is Alfred Mutai, a little known politician, how is he able to defeat the Deputy Speaker of Kenya's Parliament, Moses Cheboy? I think some of these are very interesting. We call them narrative and anecdotes in journalism, small stories within a big story. How are we able to have these small stories in this bastardized politics? How? I think for civil society, like you people, I think these are important stories for you to follow, dig deep, and establish how are these people able to defy the odds to win in the type of politics that we have seen in Kenya. I mean, it's a fact that politicians and the aristocrats in Kenya do not even shy away from talking about the buying and how they benefit from politics. A day before the election, Irungu Kangata, who is the governor-elect Muranga, I don't know if he has already been sworn in, wrote an OPD in the Sunday Nation just a day before the election. And in that OPD, he was appealing to the people in central Kenya, but in a very tactical way, because the heading of the OPD was that, Mr. President, you are safer with your deputy in your retirement. In other words, he had no serious issue with his former boss Kenyatta, but it was important for the people in central Kenya to save Kenyatta. The only way they would save Kenyatta was by voting William Ruto, and he gave a litany of points. But among those points was the fact that the Kikuyus and the Kalenjins have monopolized government positions, the political offices and the technical offices. And his point was to the Kikuyus, because the way I read this article, it was meant for the people in central Kenya, that because for us, the Kalenjins and the Kikuyus, we've monopolized these positions. When Ruto comes into office, you're not going to experience any chaos that some people are going to be chased away, because they have been a part of the project. But the Jaluos have never benefited. So this will be their turn. But in order to benefit, some people are going to be displaced. And it's us who are going to be displaced. You can imagine, openly in the Sunday Nation. And he's an intellectual, with a PhD in law. Don't think that he had gone nuts. He knew what he was talking about. He hadn't gone nuts. He timed his article pretty well. Because he writes every Sunday. But he waited for the Sunday just a day before the election and was telling the Kikuyus, if the Luos get power, you're going to be displaced. So it's about displacement. And because the voters know that when you occupy that office, you're going to benefit, so they are also going to demand. Something from you for you to be able to win. So in my view, I think, as a way forward, I think we need to interrogate the few stories you would call success stories of people who have been able to defy the odds and win, despite the way the politics has been bastardized. Secondly, I also think regulation alone is not going to help, because this business requires two parties, the party that gives and the party that receives. And for those of you that have followed this election, the two parties enjoy this game. Nobody seems to be offended. But I believe one of the things that can help to change this mindset is the growth of these societies, just like Karl Marx urged in his Communist Manifesto, the so-called proletarian revolution. I believe that naturally certain changes are going to happen even without anybody directly influencing these changes. Once the society grows economically, as we have seen it growing in Kenya, once the society grows economically, you're going to have people of means who do not necessarily have to vote for somebody because he has paid them. And they are going to have very high standards for leaders. I also think as a society grows economically, it also grows in terms of civic competence. I think indirectly, civil society organizations have also got to put emphasis on these other attendant factors, because in the long term, they are going to help nations like Kenya, Uganda, and others to have a society that can demand certain things from a leader, not monetary, but true leadership, to get to a situation where we vote for leaders that we expect to deliver services, to question government, not leaders who are going to buy us a few things, a few goodies during the campaign. At the end of the day, you'll have leaders, because if leaders know that if they oppose and suspend finance campaigning laws, they are not going to be voted again in another cycle of elections, then they will not do so. But the moment they know that the voters do not give a damn, they will continue. It's the nature of man. Man, it is said, is essentially evil. It is the conditions around him that compel man to be sober. So if the conditions around the politician in Kenya compel him or her to be evil, we're going to have we're going to continue having those kinds of politicians. So I think the approaches that we have got to take in most of these emerging democracies are going to be multi-pronged. Laws alone are not going to work, because laws do not work in a vacuum. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kazibu. I don't know whether Mr. Derek is now back online, because I wanted him to give us some of the things that happened there. But if he's not yet back, I want to go back to Henry. It has been argued that money has been used to control voter consent in very many African countries. And you are in Kenya, and you can also draw a parallel between what happens here in Uganda. Because in Kenya, it seems money is being put not only, a lot of money goes not on inducing voters, but on show off in terms of billboards, choppers. Can you give us a comparison whether what goes into what is spent on much? Is it on inducement or just publicity?
Oh, it's both.
Compare the two countries.
Are you asking me or somebody else?
I'm asking Henry.
Okay.
You will also give your view after Henry.
Thank you very much, Abel. Of course, we've been told by the people that developed what we call democracy today, that true democracy should be an expression of the will of the people. We have also seen that where money comes into the picture, a human being is able to change behavior instantly. And therefore, it goes without saying that when a voter sees money in his face, they would be bound to change their thoughts, but also behavior. What we have seen in most of these monetized African democracies is that when money comes into the picture, then the driving factor and motivator of deciding who to vote becomes money. All the other aspects that goes with the qualities of a leader become secondary, which is why in many countries, Uganda inclusive, politicians have discovered that actually it is easier to campaign using money than do so using ideology and political thought and philosophies. And therefore, where money comes into the picture, and especially in countries where people are poor, of course, we've been informed earlier by Ndugu Edgar that Kenya has the biggest middle class. But I think it also has a big number of poor people that do not have any access to land, people who live hand to mouth, and their only concern is the next meal. So in a situation where the next meal is not in sight, and someone comes, a good Samaritan comes through and provides this, you get to see that would influence their thinking. Now, I spoke in Kenya with quite a number of young people that voted for Ruto. And many of them, especially the mama mbogas, the border riders, market vendors, and so on, you get to see that, first of all, because Ruto had been there with them at the time of need, by providing the monies that they needed to either kickstart their businesses or give a new lease of life to their businesses. And therefore, if that is the reason that they voted for him, it means it's money they voted for, not the competencies and the qualities of Ruto as the leader. But of course, there are also a section of citizens who don't want to align with the losing side. And therefore, if a candidate has money and puts up a show that shows that he's the most powerful, of course, they will vote for that one. Now, earlier on, I think at the beginning of this year, when I went to my village, I was buying, things for my mother in the local market there. And then one of the fellows that I bought from, I think I was buying beef. He had two posters, one of a winning candidate that was a NUP one, and one of, a losing candidate that was a NUP candidate, and a winning one that was a DP. That constituency is the constituency of my brother, Sebamala. And then I asked him, how come the people here did not vote for the NUP candidate? And they told me that, you see, the NUP candidate did not put in a lot of money. This one put in more. So, and of course, when you interrogate what exactly do they mean put in more, it's the whole notion of money, informing voter decisions, of money, making people believe that one candidate is stronger than the other. And so when such things happen, the outcome of the election then ceases to be an expression of the will of the people, and then becomes an expression of the power of money. And when that happens, then we say that is controlling the consent of the people, because initially the people should be able to take own decisions informed by the qualities that they see in this leader, informed by what they know about this leader and what this leader has done, demonstrated by word and deed in the past, and then use that as point of reference. I submit, Abel.
Thank you. And I want now to bring Derek. Derek, can you hear me clearly?
I can hear you.
Okay.
My internet is still unstable, but I hope to be here.
Okay, fine. Now, you were still giving us the historical background of the law, and I think you had finalized on that aspect. Now, we have heard from Edgar, we have heard from Henry, we have heard from also Dr. Samuel. And Edgar's argument says that the reason why Kenya's politics is too commercialized is because there are very many vested interests that is around the wealthy aristocrats in Kenya. And for them to be able to gain and maintain their authority and power and also wealth, they have to make sure that they pump in a lot of money in elections. In Kenya, you've been observing this election and monitoring all these aspects. Can you give us your view of his argument? Is that the reality that happens on ground, or that's a different case?
Yeah, I think it's he is very accurate in his assessment. When it comes to politics, I think I view it personally. I view it as a return of investment. So if you are in a position where viewing politics as a business, so that the money that you use to campaign, to finance your campaign is an investment, how much are you going to be able to get back? And if you look at it, it's actually a very good investment. In Kenya, we have one of the highest paid members of parliament in the world. Our members of parliament are actually paid more than so many Western countries, including the UK and the United States of America. So number one, you look at in terms of salary, how much am I going to make? But that is not even enough. If you look at some of the opportunities that are there for a member of parliament to be able to make deals, get into business with government, and just make money. And there are so many opportunities for you. We have something called the Constituency Development Fund, which is a kitty that is given to members of parliament just to implement development projects in their constituency. This was recently declared unconstitutional, but it was a very good motivation and conduit for members of parliament to get elected into office. And then also look at some of the individuals in public office who intend to contest for office. Some of the biggest corruption scandals in our country have been attributed to financing campaigns. So assuming you are the governor or a cabinet secretary, you want to contest in the elections are coming. Do you use your money or steal money to use it? So that whether you win or lose, you aren't affected personally. And then also looking at the demand side. In Kenya, and I think many African countries, we have always viewed our leaders as a social security safeguard or safety net in one way or the other, so that if you wake up every time a member of parliament is visiting a certain place, you find a lot of people there asking for money, and they will say, oh, my child does not have fees, someone is unwell, so can you please chip in? So, and that is also campaigning in one way or the other. So this member of parliament or elected leader has to find a way in which their money gets back, the money that they've campaigned, and empirically, regardless of how much one spends, at the end of it, there is always, they end up better than when they got into offices. We see them buy expensive vehicles, build big houses, and just goes to show to anyone who is outside that the moment I get in there, no matter how much I spend, I will get my money back. And it encourages them to spend as much as they want. I just wanted to add something, lest my network gets lost again, on the background that I gave you. After Parliament rejected these regulations in 2016, 2021, last year, that's when we took them to court. And our argument was that Parliament should, in the first place, have nothing to do with campaign finance regulations, because they were essentially regulating themselves, which doesn't make sense. And the reason I gave that historical background was just to, in summation, was that our regulatory and legislative framework as is designed to fail. So the moment, as long as we have Parliament in the conveyor belt of campaign financing, then we will never have regulations that work, because they are essentially regulating themselves, and they will design it either to fail or frustrate it into being implemented. And that is why in our constitution we had the election management body, IEBC, the body that is supposed to regulate campaign financing. So our argument in court was that this is a function specifically set aside to IEBC. It is not a shared function with Parliament. And those two should be separated. It's not a statutory instrument or something that Parliament comes up with. It is a constitutional instrument. But unfortunately, again, the court also did not fully agree with us and gave us a very funny ruling. The court said that, yes, we agree with you that Parliament cannot regulate how much it spends. So in terms of spending limits, that is something that should be out of parliamentary ambit. However, regulations in terms of reporting, when these regulations come into place, just the logistical issues should be within parliamentary ambit. So essentially what the court told us, these regulations will have to go to Parliament, but the spending limits don't have to go to Parliament. But then says that these spending limits cannot work without regulations. So the court throws us into that mix-up again, that we find ourselves where we, I think our courts have tried to be Solomonic, but it never works. So we find ourselves in in the very same space. And we will appeal. We have filed a notice of appeal, and we intend to appeal that judgment, so that we have at least something. So we have gone into the 2022 general elections without any regulations again. And before I end, let me just give you some context in the terms of numbers. I know when I was away, there was a conversation of helicopters. I don't know if this was touched. In case it was, apologies. Between 2020, in the last 2 years, we have around 320, around more than 300 helicopters being imported in Kenya or leased. And we have seen a very radical shift between the last campaigns and these campaigns. In the last campaigns, we would see road shows. It was all about road show, who are the biggest and the most trucks, and we would see those caravans moving around the country. This time, it has been helicopters. So we will just find helicopters landing in a place, moving all over, and we've seen politicians covering a lot of ground on helicopters. So that is one of the indicators. Number two, there was a time our central bank issued a report that we had around 200 billion shillings in circulation outside the banking system for the last year or so. And shortly before the election campaign, we had only 3.9 billion shillings in circulation outside the banking system. So if you look at 250 billion Kenyan shillings, I think that is more than 10 million USD in circulation. What is it? What is it being used for? Of course, it is to finance these campaigns, and that's a lot of money that is being used to influence. And then lastly, because of the cost of living in the country and the poverty levels, it is very hard for us as civil society and those of us who intend to, who are working in promoting regulation of campaign financing and ethical values, to sell the message to citizens that your ethical and moral values are more important than your stomach or your basic needs. So if I'm making if maybe I'm living on less than $1 a day or $1 a day, I'm making, at the end of the day, I'm making 100 shillings. And there is a politician who comes and is willing to give me 500 shillings, 5 times what I make in a day, just because I don't think at that point. What incentive or how am I going to say no to that? When in the option, there's a civil society organization, Transparency International, coming and telling me, don't take that money. You see, these things are intertwined. So we have a much bigger problem to fix than simply regulating, having proper regulatory frameworks in our community. It goes into our economic issues, it goes into poverty, it goes into ethics and morals, and we really need to rethink maybe our approach wholesomely, just to fix this problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Derek. I want now to bring Mr. Chimuka. We have just heard from Derek, and also I want it's true, I also read the report from the South African Revenue Service, which revealed that there were over 325 helicopters that were imported on leased to Kenya in 2022. And most of those things I know ended up in what you say, it was more of now the air show, not again the road show. So I want to know from Mr. Chimuka, I know there's no difference between campaigns in Kenya and Zambia in terms of choppers and what. Can you bring us up to speed on what also happens outside of Zambia in comparison to what happens in Kenya? And what magnitude is it that side of Zambia? Mr. Chimuka, are you on?
Yes, I am on. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, you can proceed.
Are you able to hear? Yes, thank you so much. First of all, let me just give a history of campaign financing law or legislation in Zambia. So basically, Zambia has never legally provided for uh, sourcing for political parties for a long period of time. Of course, some strides were made in 2003 to try and legislate political party and campaign financing in Zambia. But of course, this did not see the light at the end of the day for reasons that, of course, the country was not in a position to be able to fund political parties. So as we speak right now, we do not have a piece of legislation when it comes to political campaign financing. What this implies is that political parties are free to get resources from different sources. This would include membership fees internally, but these monies or these resources, of course, are not enough because they rely on membership fees and some of the assets that they have, and also the wealthness of a leader that leads that particular party. So you find that these resources may not be enough for them to run an election. So what do? They look for sources outside the country. And basically, these sources outside the country, some of them are questionable sources or they are dirty sources, of course, that these different political parties do source for resources. So what happens now, to give you the scenario 2021 general election, is that, of course, this is one of the elections for us where we saw a lot of being used as transparent with more assessment on just the cost of billboards that these political parties were using, and we used proxy indicators. So you find that within a period of May and June, just for Lusaka only, the Patriotic Front, for example, spent about 6 billion on billboards. The Patriotic Front was able to book for all the spaces in different radio stations for them to be able to or different adverts where if you answer a question, you are given a sum of money that you can be able to use. Different cadres, political cadres, especially from the ruling part by then, Patriotic Front, were sleeping on monies that are sprayed with, were sleeping on beds sprayed with money. So this, to us, was one of the most expensive election that we have ever witnessed in Zambia. And in terms of where this money is coming from, since we do not have a piece of legislation, like I mentioned, comes from different, it could be in and it could be outside the country. For example, towards the last year, there were some members of the Patriotic Front who were ministers in 2016. And according to the Constitution, when we are in the campaign period, ministers have to relinquish their roles, and we do not have ministers. But by then, the ministers refused to relinquish their role, but they were taken to court and sued. And what happened is that before the 2021 general elections, the Patriotic Front paid all the dues that their ministers owed in 2016. And we do not know where that money came from as we speak right now. So what I'm trying to do is that because of a lack of this piece of legislation, there has been no integrity, no transparency and accountability in terms of where political parties do get finances to manage elections. And as a result, to some extent, we have seen that our country has been auctioned to a certain extent, in that, during the period of the Patriotic Front, we could see, for example, road construction was given always to one contractor, okay? And this contractor, to some extent, had pumped a lot of money to fund the Patriotic Front government by then. And this, to some extent, of course, brings in the issue of state capture, it brings in the issue of police capture, and so forth and so on. And since these private sector businesses pump in a lot, how this money is to ensure they influence whatever policy, they influence whatever decisions that the government is making when it comes to sharing of the national resources. So you discover that the government will always have a sector. Okay, for example, here in Zambia, we have got a sector called infrastructure development. The government will always have a sector where they could pump a lot of resources. And why are they pumping a lot of resources? Because this is where these people that pumped a lot of resources in that particular political party will recoup their money. And this money is not just the principal amount of money that they spent, it will have to come with the interest. I'll give you an example. For example, when you look at the 2020 Auditors General report here in Zambia, we lost about 1.4 billion Zambian kwacha to a contract that was given to a cartel of people, but just because government failed to pay a part, government failed to pay these people money as agreed, like first installment. The contract started any interest to a tune of 1.4 billion. This was for a company to build a food reserve agents shelters. So these shelters were not built, but a company went away with a whooping 1.4 billion kwacha. Already that there is a calculated move in terms of political corruption. And this political corruption is coming as a result of allowing political parties to resource from dirty hands. So as we speak right now, to some extent, here in Zambia, we have allowed political parties to source monies from dirty hands. And when this particular political party comes into power, those people that funded that particular political party will have to recoup the money whatsoever way. And this is the situation as we speak right now, because we do not have this piece of legislation which could regulate the amount of which could regulate where political parties could get the funds, give us the accountability, and also probably give put a cap in terms of how much money a political party will. Maybe just before it, I would also mention on the issue of how this big money has actually affected the electorates. Of course, here in Zambia, it's in plain and white that electorates down there could be urban dwellers or rural dwellers. We will just wait for a bigger pocket. That is a person that they are going to give attention to. A person who doesn't have resources, of course, becomes very difficult for them to be able to reach in Zambia. So it means that the mindset of electorates has completely changed from looking at the qualities of a person to looking at how much money can this person give us. Okay? And to some extent, vote buying has actually influenced people's decision. And we saw it in 2021, where the then ruling Patriotic Front government, even before the general election, when we had by-elections, they could create a non-existing emergency situation where there's a by-election, for example, if it is in the northern part, then they could create an emergency so that they could send social cash transfers in terms of staffs, fictitious kind of development, for example, doing improving the health sector, so that people can just be moved in one way or the other. So basically, as we speak right now, of course, it's on a sad part that due to this corrupt kind of life that we have allowed in our electoral process, different governments at the time when they have sensed that, of course, we are going out, they don't have any message for the electorate. What they resort to think, just like the Patriotic Front thought, was that if they could have a lot of money in they will definitely buy their way out. However, I think to some extent, the electorates in Zambia were able to redeem themselves. It was an issue whereby electorates, of course, could accept these monies, but at the time of voting, a political decision was made to be able to redeem themselves. So, of course, I want to agree on that money actually has influenced the outcome of each from different electoral levels. Sure, it could be at parliamentary, it could be at parliament, and so forth and so on. And of course, the appeal is that we need to have possibly a legislation as far as political party and campaign financing is concerned to be able to contain this so that we are able to know where political parties get the funds that they want to pump in elections. I submit for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chimuka. I want now to bring Council Edgar Tabaro. You've just heard Mr. Chimuka discuss about some of the things that's posed by a threat of too much money in politics. That he has discussed about state captivity and policy capture. And in some African countries, we have dominant political parties that have been in power for some good long time, and it's very difficult for you sometimes to differentiate them from the state. And many opposition political parties often complain about how some of these political parties use state finances to finance their own election activities and campaigns. You, as one of the geopolitics experts in, I can say maybe Africa, what do you think needs to be done so that we can be able maybe to reduce on this kind of abuse of state resources by some of the dominant political parties that have stayed in power for so
long? You've raised a very pertinent question for the democratization process in sub-Saharan Africa. In Kenya, we had first a de facto one-party state from around 1969 to maybe 1982. And we had an attempted coup on 2nd of August 1982, after which President Moi, the Moi regime, enacted a de jure one-party state by amending, I think it was Article 2A of, or introducing Article 2A of the Constitution and making it a constitutional one-party state. We had that set in motion what they call in Kenyan parlance the second liberation of Kenya, more precisely, so-called the struggle for multipartyism, culminating in the elections of 1992, the first multi-party elections of 1992. They had had an early election in 1988, one of the most chaotic elections that has happened in this region. They lined up for their candidates. Remember, we also did the same thing in 1989, but theirs was much more chaotic, and for lack of a better word, it was a sham election. 1992 in Kenya, that's when monies were first poured in their politics openly. That's the first time Kenya, that's the time when the 500 bob currency note was introduced in Kenya. I remember Ruto and his running mate, Rigathi, were some of the protagonists in deepening that that monetization of Kenyan politics, and also violence, by the way. There was also another guy called Cyrus Jirongo, and the 500 bob was nicknamed the Jirongo note. Now, it had the effect of introducing runaway inflation. So runaway inflation, meaning monies in excess of, in circulation in excess of the goods and services that are being produced. The same situation we are having at present. But the aspect I wanted to bring, particularly after the Zambian aspect, the Zambian processes have been brought to our attention, and the dominance of certain political parties. Now, the clamor for multi-party democracy in Africa gained currency in 1990 And across Africa, Rwanda, Burundi, the then Zaire, Congo Republic, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, Kenya, a bit of Tanzania, Sudan, Khartoum, Ghana, and surprisingly, Uganda was not among those countries. There was a clamor for democracy. There were pro-democracy demonstrations demanding for return of multi-party democracy in Africa. Now, how the countries churned out, or how the democratic processes turned out, also has a background in their political economy. Now, countries like Uganda, Burundi, Rwanda, Angola, Zimbabwe, the political parties that emerged to be dominant, I would even add Tanzania, were those ones that have a background in the so-called revolutionary struggle. The revolutionary struggle. So the revolutionary parties that were basically, for lack of better language, really, and I beg your indulgences in this, they were founded on political violence. And those entities that were founded on political violence became political parties to participate in basically civil processes. Now, if you go and look at how all of those countries I've mentioned, how their multi-party democracy has turned out, it's basically entities that are deepened, entities that are grounded in political violence, participating in a civil space. So they've turned out to be very dominant, and their politics has become increasingly militant, that they stifle the civic, the civil, other civil, civic, whatever political parties that have emerged. I would even say the same thing for Tanzania. Under Kikwete, you remember the Minister for Home Affairs going on the floor of Parliament and saying, mukifanya fujo, lazima mutapigwa, and he was demonstrating how they'll beat their opponents. I'm singling out Tanzania because Tanzania is the better performing of all those entities I'm mentioning: Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Zaire, Angola. And the Zimbabwe situation is very well known. Now, Zambia, Malawi, Ghana, Kenya, surprisingly even Nigeria now, Mali to an extent tried but fell back into confusion and military coups. Benin, Senegal. Now, these countries have had the distinguished advantage over the others that we have had transfer, one, to an extent, we have had elections where the incumbents are not on the ballot paper. I don't know whether we're together. It's a very critical point to note that we have had elections in those countries where the incumbent is not on the ballot paper. Believe me, that may be a small step, but a giant move in terms of deepening democracy. Two, all those countries have had a shift of power from a ruling party to the opposition. Mind you, in Kenya, what is the ruling party and opposition may be blood now. I mean, 20 years ago, 20 years ago, Rigathi, Kenyatta, Uhuru Kenyatta, Wakina Ruto, and for some period, Raila were all in the same party. They were the ruling party. But soon after that, I think Raila abandoned ship with Kibaki Tosha. Then I think returned in 2007, and all of them somehow were in the same. Kenya has a very interesting, it's an interesting case study. But so the point I'm making is that the way political party or multi-party democracy has been churned out in this region is largely based on the processes that informed the politics in the country post 1990. Congo, you know, you remember the entity that took to a political struggle throughout Mobutu. In Burundi, we had an attempt at multi-party democracy which failed miserably with a genocide in 1993. Then a factionalized government that followed that couldn't hold water. Then a coup d'etat. Then 2005, you have CNDD, FDD, which is basically a military unit becoming a whatever political party and has dominated politics since 2005. In Tanzania, TANU, which became later Chama cha Mapinduzi. You know that. So in Malawi, Zambia, it's been markedly different because of those aspects. One, an incumbent not being on the ballot paper. Two, that they've transferred the power from a ruling party to the opposition, and later also reverting that dynamic. And lastly, the civic competence of these jurisdictions. If you look at where democracy is more deepened in this region, it's more pronounced where we have higher civic competence. Where we have higher civic competence. Democracy, rule of law, which is an intrinsic aspect of democracy, is deepened in jurisdictions where they have higher civic competence. And when I'm talking of civic competence, I'm not talking of just community-based organizations. I'm talking of a country's intelligentsia. And when I mention intelligentsia in Ugandan parlance, we wrongly refer to them as elite. Elite is really, it's a very confusing term because elite means people in charge. But when you talk of the intelligentsia, you're talking of professional bodies, you're talking of industrialists, you're talking of businessmen, you're talking of trade unionists, you're talking of community-based organizations, you're talking of commodity chain associations. So when you go to Kenya, the intelligentsia was very critical, and up to the present, they are very critical in deepening their democracy. So in Kenya, you'll find industrialists like Ken Matiba, businessmen like Martin Shikuku, mentioned many names. Martin Shikuku, Paul Mwite was Secretary General of Safina Party, President of the Law Society of Kenya, very wealthy fellow. You had the President of Safina Party, Richard Leakey, a very well-established and renowned conservationist, archaeologist. Now, you had that caliber of people being at the forefront of clamor for deepening of democracy. The same situation will be seen in Malawi. Bakili Muluzi, who basically dethroned what they used to call the Ngwazi, late Kamuzu Banda, was a trade unionist in the postal union. You go to Zambia, same thing, who was it? Chiruba, Frederick Chiruba. I mean, the present president of Zambia is a businessman. He's a businessman. Now, compare those jurisdictions. But even Nigeria, by the way, the democracy we have there, the likes of Abiola, Moshood Abiola, late Chief Ernest Shonekan. Shonekan was the biggest retail trade and distributor. He had the franchise for Pepsi Cola in Nigeria. Buhari might have been a general, but he had retired into business. So you find businessmen called intelligentsia. What we
I think Tabaro's network is not.
Abel, you are muted. You are muted, Abel.
The difference between, it was giving us a difference between some countries that attain their democracy through ways that are really progressive, and those ones that came through revolutionary movements and turned into political parties. So I wanted to bring Dr. Kazibu here now. You've just had Mr. Edgar Tabaro try to give us a background on how some of the processes we went through in terms of growing up political parties. Like, for example, countries like Uganda, Burundi, Rwanda, Angola, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, and Congo Zaire. He's talking about revolutionaries who went the bush and fought, turned their revolution ideas into political parties, and ended up now turning things which, instead of running the country civilly, they are running it in a militant way. And we are seeing most of these countries which had revolutionaries turn into political parties, or revolutionary movements turn to political parties, are now encroaching on some of the state resources to keep themselves in power. So I wanted to know from you, how can we be able to delink some of these parties from encroaching on state resources to keep hold of power, so that they can also be able to make sure that there is competition and other people from opposition are given space to compete with them meaningfully. I'm muted, Dr. Kazibwe.
Oh, sorry, I had forgotten that I had muted. I was saying that I agree entirely with the Council Tabaro that there is a very big problem in many African states where the so-called revolutionary groups metamorphosed into political parties. And we expected those groups with a violent background to herald democracies in their respective states. I think we expected too much from them, and he has given quite a number of examples of places where these political parties have failed and have continued to be violent until today. But the question you addressed to me was, how do we get out of this? I think, again, one of the points has been raised by Edgar, that there is need for the intelligentsia, which he has explained pretty well. Many people tend to confuse it when we use the term elites. But the intelligentsia in majority of these countries has played a very critical role. Look at Nigeria and the two leading contenders today, Bola Tinubu and Alhaji Abubakar Atiku, typical intelligentsia. So they've got a stake in their country, and they have risked everything to ensure that they have a democratic state. Now, in many of these other states, including Uganda, people in that category do not want to participate in the politics. We trying to behave like the proverbial goose which swore never to step in the water till it learns how to swim. And you wonder how it would ever learn how to swim without stepping in the water. So for them, they on the side saying the politics is bastardized. We are waiting for that moment when we can see sober people. People are not going to mudsling others. That's when we will join. When will that time ever come? We need to see the Kenneth Matibas. I mean, he lost his all, but for the good of Kenya, who was a stinkingly rich man, who would probably have chosen to be on the sidelines and live comfortably. In fact, the last time he even contested in 1992, he was crippled. That's why he couldn't even append his signature on his petition. And the court struck it out using that technicality when he sued, challenging the election of Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi in 1992. But many others, including people like Paul Mwite and many others. So I think some of the countries that are still lagging behind on the African continent, it's because the people in the intelligentsia have decided to stay on the sidelines. Then two, the issue of civic competence is also going to be important. But at the end of the day, I must say, there is some ray of hope. There is some ray of hope when we see what's happening, I mean, in Kenya. Despite the many things we have talked about Kenya in the last 1.5 hours, you still believe that it's a way ahead of many African states because of the sacrifices of men and women. People like Wangari Maathai. I mean, she would have afforded a better life outside Kenya. Kenneth Matiba and the others. I mean, even Charity Njiru, Martha Karua and the others. Now, when you look at countries like Uganda, where do you see people in that league actively taking part in the border politics? I mean, it's a very huge challenge. It's a very huge challenge. I don't know what we can do to encourage such people to join. I mean, just imagine this election. The former CEO of Kerochi Industries in Kenya quitting her job to say, I'm going to stand as a senator of Nakuru. We need to see people like Henry Maguzi, Abel, and others saying we are leaving our comfort zones. Let's go for those small posts. Let me give you another example. In Kenya, besides the MP seats, you're having people with doctorates standing to become ward representatives. In some of those councils, you now have people with PhDs. You have people with masters. So I think in majority of these countries that are still lagging behind in terms of deepening democracy, it's because the intelligentsia has decided to be indifferent, and they are waiting for that time when everything has settled, when there is an easy calm. And I don't think that time will ever come when we are just watching indifferently. But my point is that despite the challenges, we can see some ray of hope in countries like Kenya. We can see some ray of hope in countries like Zambia. Our colleague here has explained pretty well that despite the fact that the incumbent government of PF had all the resources of the state, the population chose to say no. And mark you, that was not the very first time. In the early 90s, that's how Chiluba came to power. That's how he came to power. That's how he was able to defeat the late Kenneth Kaunda. So lastly, the other important point is that we also need to appreciate that in majority of these countries where you see serious transformation in terms of democracy, it's true you're not seeing incumbents on the ballot papers. The moment incumbents choose to stay in power until when their maker calls them, you're going to have violent elections in every cycle, because for them it's a do or die. Probably if Moi in Kenya had chosen to stand in 2002, he would have died president of Kenya. And I'll end with this story, which has been told several times by William Ruto, that at one point they were seated in the State House of Kenya as results were coming out of the presidential elections in 2002. Some ministers started leaving one by one, but because the results were not in their favor, it was in the open that the results were not in their favor. Now ministers were leaving. The few that had stayed along, that had stayed in the room for some time, one of them went to Ruto because Ruto had worked in the office of the president and he was thought to be close to Moi. So a colleague in the cabinet asks him, is Muzei, and was referring to Moi, watching the very same TV station we are also watching? In other words, he couldn't believe that Moi was going to let things go the way they were going. But of course, for Moi, it wasn't a do or die. He was not the one on the ballot paper. But in 1992, because he was on the ballot paper, the election was too violent. It was too violent because it was a do or die. In 2002, 10 years later, because he was not on the ballot paper, he let the election swing in all directions, even in the case where it was not in his favor. So I think it is important that we find a way of convincing leaders that have overstayed in power on the African continent to have a graceful exit, the way Moi exited the stage. Despite the many atrocities he committed in Kenya, Kenyans forgave him. That's why even at his funeral, the funeral was much more dignified than the one of Mwai Kibaki. But who of the two committed more crimes in Kenya? Who of the two had a more substantial effect in terms of development. It was certainly Chibachi. But why was Moi given a dignified send-off? Because you see, even if you develop a nation without giving it an opportunity to hand over power peacefully, all the other successes can be reversed in just 1 week. And there are many examples. We see Somalia, we see Libya, we see Ivory Coast, and many other states. So I think it's a very important point for us to address ourselves to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kazibu. Our time is fast spent, but I'm going to extend by like 15 minutes so that we can be able to conclude. I want now to bring Henry. You've just listened to Dr. Kazibu and also Council Edgar Tabaro discussing about how different political parties are formed in various countries of ours. And we have seen, for example, our own country, Uganda here, we have had one political party for almost the last 35 years. And there's always the same person in the ballot paper. And there's no way you can differentiate sometimes NRM from the state Uganda. And each time opposition keeps complaining, these people keep on using state resources for campaigns. I want you to try and compare the abuse of state resources in Uganda and what you saw in Kenya, because Kenya never had an incumbent on the ballot paper. But of course, there are allegations that there were also abuses of state resources in the campaigns of Kenya. How do you compare the two countries in terms of the large-scale abuse of state resources?
Of course, Abel Ndugu Tabaro hit the nail on its head earlier on when he compared the political parties and the kind of democracies we have in the two categories of sub-Saharan Africa, where you have situations where the political parties, the ruling parties, we went into opposition, and situations where you have political parties, you have revolutionary movements that came, transformed themselves into political parties. Now, I think if you look at the cases of Uganda, Rwanda, and others in that fold, I think it's contingent on the leaders that are occupying office to understand that the future of their countries depends on them, and that the earlier they gracefully retire, the better. But I also went back and picked it up from where our ancestors left it. The point on what is Africa's political thought. I think we need to pick up African political thought for the countries that have not yet reached there. Countries like Uganda, Rwanda, which have not reached there, we still have revolutionary movements that transmuted themselves into political parties in office. I think we shall get there. But that said, what is our political thought? Do we share the same political thought as Africa? And what kind of Africa do we want to see? And what is the role going to be of the different categories of the intelligentsia as you put them in Tabaro? So I think that's what. So in cases where this party that went to fight, and the fighters they used were not being paid, and they only got to pay them when they got to power, and their ability to pay them was because they captured the state and all its apparatus and made themselves into the state, in which case, therefore, you cannot tell the distinction between what is the state and what is the party. Then, of course, you see more abuses there. But I think what I saw in Kenya as well, there is a sense in which the incumbents again moved in, swung into action, because I cited on another platform a situation where outgoing President Uhuru Kenyatta carries a bailout. I think it was of 40 million Kenya shillings. I think he took it to Nzoia Sugar Company, and that money, that bailout, was to pay for the sugarcane outgrowers. And the reason they were that is being done because then there was that was a big voting population. And so to use government, and of course, as he was delivering the damage check, he accompanied it with the message that that remember Muzei and vote for Baba. So that was a misuse of a government resource for partisan political gains. Now, I understood as well that all through the campaign period, and even prior, because he started campaigning early, Nduguruto would host the coordination meetings in his current home, which is a state resource. And therefore, there was abuse and misuse of state resources across the political divide. So but it was nothing compared to situations to countries where the ruling party is fused with the state, and therefore when the state, the central bank is broke, the party is also broke. When the central bank gets money, the party gets money. So that license to raid the state coffers when they want, how they want, anytime, I think is the difference. But yes, state resource using state resources for partisan politics is one of the cancers that we have to address as Africans. I submit.
Thank you, Henry. I now want to bring Mr. Derek. What can you say before we end the show as you're parting short? Mr. Derek, are you on? Derek, can you hear me?
Yes, I
think Derek. Can you hear me?
Hear you.
Okay, Derek, yes, I can hear you now. I was asking you to give your parting shots because we are we have run out of time, but I've pushed the show for another 10 minutes. Okay, as Derek is trying to connect, I can go to Dr. Sam Kazibwe. Your concluding remarks, and as we head towards the end.
Thank you so much. I believe we still have quite a number of challenges in many African countries when it comes to the democratization process. But I also believe that there are several success stories. It's important that we draw from the examples of those success stories to better ourselves. As we speak today, we do not have to look to Asia. We do not have to look to the West. The solutions are not far away. Many of them are closer to us. If you're living in Uganda, there are one or two things you can borrow from Kenya, despite their challenges. And I think those can form a basis for our prosperity. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I now want to go back to Derek. Derek, are you on?
Yes, I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. I believe you wanted me to give my parting shot. 3 things. Number one is I have listened to the conversation on the intelligence and the elite. But
Derek, it seems your network is not your network is still poor. I cannot get you clearly. I think we shall get back to you later. I want now to go to Council Edgar Tabaro.
The moment we Hello.
Hello. Derek, your network is quite breaking. I cannot hear you clearly. So I don't know whether it's still the internet connectivity that side of yours. So I wanted to skip you and then I go to Council Tabaro.
All right, that's okay. That's in order.
Yeah, but he's back on. Can't we have
Okay,
a
Derek,
conclusion
can
from Derek?
let's hear from you since your network is a little bit clear.
All right. I promise you it's not always this way. Yeah, today is just one of those days. And I think I sent you a text. So I was saying that we need to make our politics local, both in the voters and the voted. And that will be a very great indicator of the reforms on campaign financing and even just the political analysis of it. In these elections, we had an interesting case of one politician who was elected into office. She didn't have any money. I think she's 24 years old, and she campaigned using a border that was lent to her, and actually the rider was the one paying for the fuel. Until later on, she was able to. Someone donated a Pro Box, a small. I don't know if you have Pro Box in your country, but donated it to her. Only the services, not necessarily the vehicle. And she used it to campaign, and she was able to get elected into office. Obviously, during her campaign, there was never the question of money being a determinant to those who voted for her, but they listened to her because of her policies. Next time she gets back into office, she will have money. But I hope that the rest will still be about issues and personality and not
Now, I want now to break. Network is a problem with our brother side of Kenya, so I want now to return to Council Edgar Tabaro. Your last remarks.
I hope you can hear me. Am I loud and clear? Okay, now there are many lessons to pick from the electoral process. The electoral process and the election, the eventual date of election, and the process of post-election in the Republic of Kenya. On this occasion, our discussion has been limited to monetization of the politics and what lessons we pick. But in the broader perspective of things, what we desire is deepened democracy, deepened rule of law. Now, these twin processes of respect on developing the culture of respect of the law and democratization do not fall from the sky. We have to be intentional, we have to be deliberate, and we have to be purposeful. And in the way we approach things and drive a narrative, drive a discourse towards achieving them. They are not an event, they are a process. Now, those processes can only be as vibrant and as strong as the systems put in place, the systems developed for checks and balances. Now, those checks and balances are what enable us to hold public officials to account. When public officials are not held to account, when public officials are not called to account, and they can get away with each and everything, a culture of impunity takes effect, a culture of impunity sprouts. Now, controlling political party funding is part of the processes of holding public officials to account. However, we have to have it in our minds that the political party underpinnings in a republic like Uganda, very different from what has turned out in Kenya, very different from what has turned out in Zambia, only because of our political history. So it's incumbent upon persons like yourselves and myself to call the officials to account, but also set the agenda for these narratives. These things are not going to fall from the sky. The ball is right in our court. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Council Edgar. Lastly, I will want to hear from Henry, and then we conclude the show.
Thank you very much, Abel. I think it's incumbent on us as citizens as well to push for more transparency, openness, but also accountability in the manner in which they don't only manage funds, but in the manner in which decisions are taken. I think that is one thing that is lacking, because you cannot have democracy when there are no checks and balances, and it's us, the citizens, that are supposed to provide that checks and balances. In the case of Uganda, where political parties are inherently weak, opposition political parties, then it should be the citizens to step forward and assume that role. I thank you.
Thank you so much, all our guest panelists of the day today. It has come to one end of this monthly webinar series. I also want to thank our viewers and listeners outside there. This webinar series was brought to you by Alliance Finance Monitoring and the African Election Observers Network, AFIONET. The next edition of the Money in Politics webinar series will be on the last Thursday of next month. So let's get tuned, let's keep in touch. We shall roll out another edition, and we shall have different guests hosted, and we shall have a very fruitful discussion. I want to thank all of you outside there. But don't forget to subscribe to all our social media platforms on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and also TikTok.
Kenya has just gone through what is arguably the most monetized and commercialized general elections in the region. On ground, over 150 helicopters were observed being used by candidates at presidential, senatorial, and gubernatorial level. High-end SUVs were also observed being used by majority of the candidates. On one rally, the Azimio la Umoja One Kenya presidential candidate arrived at a rally with a convoy of 7 helicopters, of which 4 were privately owned. It was established that renting a chopper or helicopter was going for $2,000 per hour. There are suspicions that most of the money that was flowing in the election campaigns was coming from dirty sources, including syndicated corruption and money laundering. Kenya in 2013 developed a progressive election campaign financing law, but this law has twice been rendered futile by the same parliament that passed it. It is clear that none of the political elite in Kenya would wish to have this law enforced on them, hence the conspiracy to fight it. In the judgment made by court in May 2022, whereas court found that Parliament does not have powers to approve or disapprove the spending limits, it refused to quash the decision of the National Assembly to annul the enforcement of campaign financing regulations developed and published by the IEBC in 2021. It is against this backdrop that the Alliance for Finance Monitoring, ACFIM, in partnership with African Election Observers Network, AFIONET, have organized this webinar to interrogate the scale and magnitude of monetization of elections in Kenya and the lessons African electoral jurisdictions can draw from this.